Imagine if the new horror Smile was all about a psychotic photographer who tormented people until they posed for a photo. Well, it sounds kind of stupid, right? But how was the real movie? After witnessing a bizarre traumatic incident involving a patient, Dr. Rose Cotter starts experiencing frightening occurrences that she can't explain. As an overwhelming terror begins taking over her life, Rose must confront her troubling past in order to survive and escape her horrifying new reality. This stars Sosie Bacon as Dr. Rose Cotter. Now, she's a psychiatrist in the emergency department of a New Jersey hospital, which I thought was humorously named Mount Pleasant. Now, one day, Rose gets a patient who is clearly terrified and then acts out, bringing about horror for Rose. Now, the story itself is fairly predictable. I mean, even if you haven't seen the trailers. The arc of events are very self-explanatory, and the movie doesn't really hide too much of it or even obscure what's going on. But the anxious tension and the scares come from what plays out in front of our eyes. There's an ongoing theme of mental health within the story, and I love that while psychosis and mental instability are visualized for us within character actions, those that deal with the issues, they're not made fun of or used as punchlines. The behaviors are used to amp up the stress and the unease, but if a character makes an off-color joke about mental health, that's usually followed up with a retort or a look to showcase how inappropriate that joke actually was. Now, there are so many scenes within this that start off by making us jittery and then end with us typically jumping in our seats. I mean, and yeah, there are some jump scares within the presentation, but honestly, they didn't feel cheap. These were the sort that just kind of appear within a camera movement or in the background. The music will ramp up to a stinger, usually providing that extra oomph that scares. But I mean, seriously, several times when I jumped, I then laughed out loud because of how impressive the scene was. Or maybe I just needed to relieve some of the anxiety. We saw this in a packed theater, and the reactions were awesome as a collective experience. We'd jump, shout, wince, and then laugh. I mean, in each of those emotive outbursts, they were earned. Now, I'm sure there are going to be some comparisons to a few movies, because while this presentation is new, the storyline, it's fairly familiar. And I can see this being compared with a Japanese horror from 1998, or even an American horror from 2014. And they each share similar elements. And just like those two films, Smile is effective in capturing the dread. Now, in addition to Sosie Bacon, we get some great performances from Jessie T. Usher, Gallner, Weigert, Kal Penn, and Rob Morgan. And each gets different moments to draw out personality quirks that typically lead to very unsettling interactions. I think my favorite, though, out of the supporting cast was Weigert. She has a few quieter moments with Bacon's Rose where we can feel this mounting apprehension. And Bacon then really creates a convincing character. Rose is grounded, but she's traumatized, which helps to keep her on edge. And we watch her personality morph as time progresses. She's deteriorating mentally just due to the stress that she's experiencing. And there are little physical quirks that she adds to the character that make her all the more real. She'll incessantly bite her nails or even just wipe her face with her hands. I mean, sometimes to get something off, but mostly just as a nervous tick that says a ton without using any words. The cinematography is awesome too. A few times Dutch angles are used where the camera twists into this odd angle that's meant to put us ill at ease. But the shots that I found the most unsettling were exterior aerials where a vehicle would be shown driving along a road, and then as it passed, the camera would continue just to rotate until that horizon line had flipped, so that made the ground the sky and then vice versa. And the visual was beautiful, but it really did mess with my head. And then there are the effects that come into play. Most are practical in nature, and they look super convincing. Now, there's a reveal in the final act that has some wildly upsetting visuals, and I loved how it made my skin crawl. Now, some of these in that final act were CGI'd, but they still looked creepy and they added another layer of awe to the story. Now, I was surprised that this was just short of 2 hours. Normally in a horror, they are a little shorter, and I didn't really mind the time in this. But there was one point around the middle where I did wonder how much time was left. And I think that's just because the story had hit a lull and I was noticing the length. But the movie finishes out really strong with a driving urgency, thanks in part to an impending time limit that's inherent to the story. And this quickens the pace and it makes for a very exciting conclusion. But that being said, it is a very predictable ending. I mean, just like the majority of the film. And even though I mostly knew where this was headed, and then I certainly could guess the finale, I was still crazy invested and was very, very tense through the entire thing. Now, when we walked out, my arms, legs, and butt were a little fatigued from all the clinching, which to me marks the effectiveness of the overall execution. Now, the story may be predictable, but it did exactly what it set out to do: scare me, thrill me, and then keep me entertained. So overall, Smile is a freaky look at trauma, using the vehicle of mental health to drive the narrative. While there are several jump scares, they're used effectively to unsettle and unseat without feeling cheap or unearned. Sosie Bacon is wonderful at capturing a character who mentally declines as she questions her reality. And while the story feels a tiny bit long and the whole project is predictable, the final product is an anxious and stressful ride that could put a huge smile on your face. There's no sex or nudity, a ton of profanity, and some very brutal violence. And also, there are major plot points that revolve around suicide, so just know that that is a factor within the story. I give Smile 4 out of 5 couches. So what's a horror movie that just unsettles the crap out of you? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.